So we have co-authors of Lissa, which is a story of medical promise, friendship, and revolution. So if you want to know what the book's about, it's about medical promise, friendship, and revolution. We've got Sherine Hamdy. I meant to ask you how to say your last name. Sherine Hamdy and Coleman Nye. And then we also have multiple award-winning author, including Eisner and a Bram Stoker Award for Kindred recently, John Jennings, and author and creator of La Borinqueña. Jeez, I totally
Edgardo Miranda-Rodriguez.
There you go. Sorry, I don't know why I just blanked on. I introduced him yesterday. No problem. All right, so I think that's the intro part of it. Today we're going to be talking about representation in graphic novels. It's a real kind of rarity that we get to talk about graphic novels at a book festival that's primarily prose. And then it's also great that we're talking about representation. And I think that, just to be clear with everyone, representation, we're talking about representation of minorities or underrepresented people, like cohorts within the larger American society at large. So yeah, so I think since we're talking about graphic novels here, I think I want to ask each of you why you decided why pictures instead of just words. Anyone want to take that?
Because I've never written prose before, and previously to doing my own comic La Borinqueña, I had actually produced a few graphic novels with DMC from Run DMC, John Leguizamo, and I run my own design studio, so I'm an art director. So I think and speak visually. And I've always read and enjoyed comic books, which, according to an article I recently read by Jean Lewin Young, is the fact that, and I agree with him, it's intellectually more stimulating to read a graphic novel, unlike what many people may not think who don't read graphic novels, because there's a lot more in terms of cerebral processing beyond the actual word. You're looking at imagery, which actually can also be interpreted in various ways, just as actual text is. And I have fun writing and visualizing, because when I write a comic book, I see it as I'm actually art directing a story versus just actually putting letters and paragraphs on a page. I said before that my script for my book is actually a lot more dense than the actual comic book itself, because there's so much thought that I put into each panel, the history, the references, the visual and the literary references in the book, that I leave it up to the reader to interpret that for themselves when they're looking at the book. I don't want to spoon feed my readers, and my readers can be anyone around the age of 3 or 4 to 44 or 84. So it's about kind of like creating a universal way of storytelling, and that's what's always attracted me to comics, because when I grew up reading comics in the 70s and 80s, they weren't pandering, and they weren't also over sexualizing and over introducing aggrandizing violence, for example. And oftentimes in mainstream storytelling in comics now, they tend to write comic books that are too juvenile for children, and those markets always seem to fail, or too violent for children and all audiences. And I like having that happy medium, and that's really why I chose to do graphic novel storytelling. And it's a lot cheaper than making a movie.
Yeah. You, ladies?
So Coleman and I are actually academics, and we had written our research up in anthropological, academic, ethnographic style. And then we thought that by putting our two research cases together, we could tell a really exciting story in graphic novel form that would have a much wider reach. And also there was a lot more we could do. We could add so many layers of complexity through the visual, because a lot of times when you're describing, our story takes place in Egypt, and a lot of times when you're describing unfamiliar places, you get bogged down with so much detail explaining the setting that it drags the plot down. But we could just visually represent the setting and move the plot along. So that was another incentive.
And another part of our, I mean, there are so many layers to it, but I mean, even in terms of academics, one of the things we say is comics is not a dumbing down. It's actually like there's so many different layers that you can bring to the text. you can tell a story, but like the reader brings so many other things into the text as well. And then you're talking about that too, like thinking about the ways in which you can fill in between the gutters, the ways in which you can read yourself into the text, because comics are often more accessible just in terms of like visually, how you can represent, just a simple face, for example, what that can bring you into. And then we were also trying to tell a global story. So we were trying to tell a story about connections between the US and Egypt that didn't like compare them, but actually did kind of complex mappings and intersections between the spaces. And so you can juxtapose different spaces, different times. I mean, this is like really important in what you're doing too. And to show the ways in which these spaces are deeply interconnected rather than like reinforcing an idea of like the West versus the rest. This is the US, this is Egypt. And that became a really helpful way for us to tell a much more complex story about global inequalities and medical technologies and these types of things as well.
Hello? Oh, okay. Yeah, so I fell in love with comics like super early. I am originally from the South, I'm from Mississippi, and I grew up in a kind of really kind of agrarian, kind of isolated space. But my mother, she was a literature major at Alcorn State University, and I was surrounded by books constantly. So I fell in love with like mythology and folklore, like super early, right? So Egyptian mythology, Norse mythology in particular, Greek mythology. And of course, that segued into like reading the Mighty Thor and Superman and Daredevil and all these different characters, which my mom also introduced me to. The other thing is that she was an avid reader of like everything speculative. So I'm talking like horror, I'm talking science fiction and fantasy. I was reading like probably stuff I shouldn't have been reading, like super early. And I think it was just a way for us to like talk as a family or as a mother and son about the things that frighten us or the things that like modes of escape, from Mississippi, to a certain degree. That was my sunken place for real. If you get that reference. Yeah, so I think that I fell in love with signs and symbols super early too. I mean, my mother always had she had these like illustrated psychology books, and it was from the 1970s. And I was always really fascinated by like what I now look at as symbolic communication. Little did I know that I was actually like falling in love with visual communication or graphic design. My background is also in graphic design. I taught graphic design for like 20 years. And what Edgardo is saying about like the notion of art directing, that's definitely part. I look at like comics as like straight up like graphic design. And also, as you were saying as well, it's a way of, interpreting multiple modes of reading, right? Multiple modes of literacy, right? So if you're looking at like something like CNN or like CSNBC or whatever, you always see like the graphic of the person talking to you. You also see like something going on in the background. There's an image of whatever the news story is in the corner, and there's a crawl going at the same time. You're reading different modes of experiences, of different mediations. And I think that's actually what probably led me to teach in a media and cultural studies program when I saw that, I've been doing this thing around practice, and I wanted to actually follow it up. And so I think comics are kind of a forgotten literacy too, because they used to be really ubiquitous. It used to be on every corner, right? It'd be newsstands, spin racks, yeah. And so when they created the direct market, they kind of took that literacy away from us a little bit. So people like, I don't even know how to read this thing. I was like,
and direct market meaning actual comic book stores where only comic books are available at.
That's right. And so by doing that, they kind of like isolated the form to a certain degree. So now it's like, well, what's up with these comics things? That's a new thing. I was like, no, we've been doing comics since hieroglyphics and cuneiform, seriously.
So speaking of symbols, I wanted to get into this with you. So there's a lot of like lack of representation that we've had, and I think we can all agree that when representing minorities within comics, like owning your narrative is important, right? Like we need to be in charge of how our stories are told, like as a Latino, as African American, as Muslim, Islam, all these. And unfortunately, there have been representations that have preceded us that we weren't in control of. Yeah. So how do you guys feel about reappropriating some kind of visual vernacular that existed before us, right? I've seen a lot of black artists recently like taking that kind of Sambo iconography and just putting it out there as like, no, this is ours now. Like you don't get to voice this on us. We get to own this. And I think even with like Latino representation, it's like we get to take the things, those things that kind of were caricatures of us and push those forwards. And then something like Egypt is something that we're kind of, we've had this idea of the Islamic terrorist, you know, like with a turban and a sword ready to blow this the hell up. I mean, like, so how have you guys, I guess, either leaned into the forms that have preceded us, and then how are you subverting or reappropriating those?
That's such a loaded question.
Sorry, I can go to some. Where do you get your ideas from?
I know, right? Well, I'll speak obviously from in terms of how I put my work together. I decided to work with everything that is formulaically at our hands in terms of what traditional superhero storytelling is, and I literally like flipped it on its head. For the most part, superhero genre storytelling, obviously dominated by Disney and Marvel, is for the most part patriarchal and for the most part very white male dominate, right? And which oftentimes is like synonymous with patriarchal for redundancy's sake. And oftentimes, and you hinted at this in terms of like what you went into it initially with comic book storytelling. In terms of mythology is always rooted in some shape or form in these in this genre by Eurocentric mythologies, Greek, Roman, Norse, even the Bible. For all sakes and purposes, you know, Superman is either Jesus or Moses, depending on how you interpret it, right? So I looked at all of this stuff because one of the things I wanted to do intentionally when I worked on my project was play into the psychological conditioning that already exists within the consumer. I am not in any way, shape, or form expecting to undo how we've been trained to read, see things for decades, for generations. So I said, okay, well, let me just work with what's in there and actually flip it. So the character's costume design. Everyone, whether they read or not read comic books, associates a cape always with a superhero. That was going to be definitely put in. And in terms of the mythology, everyone always looks at the typical origin story. When I decided to tap into mythology from the indigenous people of Puerto Rico, which are the Taínos, and actually looking at their structure of deities, which is obviously, for those who aren't familiar, is the opposite of patriarchal. It's actually a matriarchal deity. Atabex is the mother goddess of Puerto Rico from Taino mythology. So that automatically flipped it. And she has twin sons, Huracan and Yucahu, who are, and Huracan literally is the Taino word for hurricane, which is the word we actually use today without knowing that actually has roots in the Caribbean, specifically in Puerto Rico. So I decided to kind of literally look at what is there and flip it. It's kind of like what hip hop did with sampling, you know? So I sampled everything that existed and flipped it and reinterpreted it in a way so that when people see the book, they think they've already seen this character, even though the book itself is only about a year old. The character herself is only about 1.5 years old. But by tapping into these kind of like already existing formulated perceptions of what a superhero looks like, it actually did work, you know. And I get often the question like, how long have you been working on this? How many years? And I'm like, you know, since you were a kid. I was like, no, about 1.5 years ago. I did it as a 45-year-old man. And it was because of having 20 years of experience as an art director, also predating that as an educator and activist, that I deliberately poured that all into creating this project.
I'm not, okay. All right. Yeah, that's a great question. I think about it a lot because in the academy, I used to teach the image making courses, and I used to be really concerned with the ethics around, you know, how we are formulating identity and images. I was training like graphic designers who are going out into the world to work with like, you know, ad agencies, marketing firms with very little knowledge of anything outside of their immediate experiences, right? Sometimes I would be the only black professor they've ever seen. I mean, when I was at the University of Illinois, I was the only black art professor for like the 6 years I was there. I was actually the first African-American to get tenure in art at U of I, right? So a lot of times I was bringing my culture, hip hop, you know, the blues, everything, every type of like different type of cultural production into the classrooms and actually introducing those things to my students who are mostly, you know, white, Asian students who are coming from the Gold Coast of Chicago, you know. I did teach at HBCU as well, where it was the reverse problem. I'm trying to introduce practices to like an African-American community that didn't have like access to, you know, traditional art training or what have you. So like the idea of like reappropriation is something I'm really into. Recontextualization, which is the second way that you kind of subvert stereotypes, and also inversion, where you just essentially like turn the stereotype inside out. I'm really fascinated by stereotypes as a design historian too, because stereotypes deal a lot with fixity, right? In fact, stereos means hard or fixed. That's what it means, and it comes out of the printing, you know, profession, A stereotype is actually a form of printing. It was created by Fernandino in like the 1800s. So we don't really start using it as a way to talk about stereotyping the way we're thinking about it until the 1920s. By Walter Lippmann reappropriates that. And so I'm very much into realigning subjectivity, because a lot of times stereotypes of the black body can get you killed. Like, for instance, Trayvon Martin's body was being read as thug, as angry black man, as buck, instead of like kid trying to go and get an iced tea and some Skittles, right? And so I'm really into this notion of like how texts or bodies as texts get read, right? So recently I've been thinking about this notion of what I call critical race design studies. People always talk about like social constructs, right? Like, oh, you know, gender is a construct, race is a construct. Well, where are the blueprints for it? Because I'm thinking about it as the designer. So who actually designed this thing, and how can we undesign it, you know? So that's something I've been thinking about quite a bit. And when I'm talking about stories, we're made out of stories, right?
Yeah, narrative is the
narrative.
narrative.
Race is a story.
Yeah.
It's just a story. Gender's a story. You know,
Well,
all these
identity
different
is
types.
just who you tell yourself you are.
Exactly, exactly. And so what are these master narratives coming from, and how can we subvert them? How can we actually change them? So by doing the type of activism with like creating ethnocentric conventions, like the ones that we put together, like SoulCon, the Black Comic Book Festival in Harlem, we're actually trying to reintroduce different types of agency and subjectivity through not only creating comics, but also creating spaces like this one to kind of like empower ourselves as a community, but also economically. So that's where my head is about all this stuff.
So one of the things I was thinking a lot about in portraying Muslim characters, both in Lissa and in the other graphic novel I'm still working on, is that a lot of times when we finally get Muslim mainstream characters, so like the Big Sick or Aziz Ansari, they have to disavow themselves from Islam in order to be sympathetic or relatable characters. So, you know, Kumail Nanjiani and the Big Sick is like, I don't do that prayer stuff, I don't do that Islam stuff. And so, I mean, I think there's two ways of fighting stereotypes. One is to say we're not that different, we're more like you. And another way is to say, yeah, we are like that, and that's okay. And so that was really what we wanted to do with Lissa, is to show people embracing their Muslim practices, and they were, you know, they're just regular characters. So they say these really profound theological things, like, you know, Hassan, one of the characters, is like, girls, you can't start and stop time. Time is something that only God the Almighty is in control of. But, you know, she's hanging her laundry, and like that's just part of her daily practice. And so it's like not scary. Yeah, they're wearing the galabeya and the turban, but they're just, you know, they're just regular characters. They're the dad that Layla loves and the mom that Layla loves. And then there was a second thing. Oh, the other thing I wanted to talk about in terms of stereotyping in minorities is a lot of times, like we saw with hip hop and a lot of, you know, African American art and culture, is that it just gets appropriated without, you know, without crediting the community, without understanding where it came from. And that happened with the Arab Spring. There was so much beautiful graffiti that just spread all over the cities, and the Tahrir Square and the occupation graffiti was really a strong part of it. And you see like 100 art history books all of a sudden of like the walls and graffiti, and we wanted to take that graffiti and take it seriously on its own terms, cite the artists as social theorists, as revolutionaries, as people who were saying, expressing, doing something, analyzing their situation, imagining a different future, and putting it within this global context. Like, we're not innocent in the US looking at this Arab graffiti as some kind of fetish. We are deeply implicated by, you know, the consumer practices, by the taxes we pay in supporting corrupt regimes that lead to all of this injustice and that lead to things like the revolution. So taking the graffiti, honoring it, and putting it in its context was another way we thought about representation.
You want to add anything to that?
All right, just quick. Okay. Genre is, I think, really interesting, too, in terms of, I think, one of the things that was really great for us doing comics within an academic setting and then using multiple types of visual narratives was also to engage in different practice of citation, but also to disrupt the canon, like, from within. So comics, I think, are a really interesting space in which, like, our modes of citing graffiti artists, for example, like our modes of incorporating actual people who were on the ground doing the work of the revolution that we weren't doing as real characters into the book. And then of using an academic book in graphic form all of these are also ways to draw on multiple forms of knowledge that are often subjugated, that are often devalued, within a regime that doesn't just necessarily say, and then they're valid because now it's an academic book, or they're valid now because now this particular audience can consume it, but because they're valid on their own terms. And I think sometimes genre mixing in that way, I mean, and this is what you all are already talking about, right? But genre mixing in that way becomes its own form of disruption.
Yeah, so speaking to that, another thing I wanted to talk about is with genre mixing. Comics is one of the few mediums where you can kind of switch genres mid-sentence, right? Like you can go from rigid panel to panel to like 4 pages of just montage, kind of like just ethereal ideas, kind of like poetic. And I think that part of being any kind of minority is there's a couple of aspects. There is external minority, like, you know, I'm Latino, Black, like that's just a thing. And then there's internal minority where you're like queer or Muslim or something like that. Mm-hmm. And I think that the medium of comics allows you to address both of those almost simultaneously. So I was wondering how you guys have kind of represented both the feeling, like the internal and the external aspects of being minority. I know you guys have done a great, like I looked through your work and there's a lot of great kind of montagey stuff where the panels kind of deteriorate to full page, little like hints at things, and there's like birds flying around and stuff. And I know, John, you've taken like pretty hard, rigid tropes like this 60s Marvel house style, and then just upended it and completely recontextualized it in a way that is that great like Kirby montagey stuff that is decidedly African American as well. So and I know part of that is to like basically, you know, to take the form and, you know, make it African or make it Black. And so I was just wondering like how you guys feel you represent both the internal and external aspects of being minorities within the work that you do.
I do it in terms of like I think from a production standpoint, right? I run my own design studio, so one of the things that I was very deliberate in doing with this first book that I did was to actually hire an all Puerto Rican team of artists, for example, right? And that was much more not so much a creative decision, but also kind of like a statement that I was trying to make, because the reason that I was doing this book was also to kind of show the power of the solidarity that exists within a community, that although there are 3.5 million Puerto Ricanos living on the island, there are more than 5 million of us living here throughout the United States. And I wanted to actually be able to do that. And given the fact that from a production standpoint, no one physically works in the presence of each other anymore. Literally, I have artists all across the United States and in Puerto Rico, and we communicate via social media and email. And so one of the things in designing the book, I actually had to have my illustrators unlearn a lot of what they did learn by working in the main industry, because everyone that worked on my book had professional experience either working on books for DC or Marvel, but never in their entire career as Puerto Ricanos had they had the opportunity to work alongside other Puerto Ricanos, to work on a character that actually was Puerto Riqueña, with a cast of characters that were all Puerto Riqueño. And one of the most interesting things when the book was reviewed, I believe it was, I think The Guardian did a review of my comic. They said that a richly multi-diverse comic. And I just found that fucking hilarious, because everybody in the book was Puerto Rican, but it just actually falls into the misconceptions of what a Puerto Rican looks like. Because I look around this tent right now, and everybody in this room could actually be Puerto Rican, because we're an ethnic group. We're not actually a race. We're African, European, and Taino, and sometimes even Asian is mixed into that. And in terms of like the representation of that in the book, it was really about undoing a lot of the perception. And even going back to the previous question about stereotyping, very deliberately visually trying to represent what my culture, my heritage, my people, my stories, our stories would look like when we actually did the stories. One of the most funniest conversations I had with George Perez, who's actually an icon in comics, oftentimes referred to as like the Jack Kirby of now, with over 40 years of experience creating close to 70 characters for both Marvel and DC. He's actually did the cover to my second book. This is actually his artwork right here. He retooled Wonder Woman. He's the one who actually incorporated Greek mythology into her storyline, because it never actually formally existed as part of her canon. And jokingly told me when we were in Puerto Rico, you know, a lot of people don't know that when I was drawing Wonder Woman, I was drawing a Puerto Rican woman with the curly hair, with the way her body was and everything like that. And he said, but I never actually had the chance to ever draw an actual Puerto Rican. You know, and so in my book, it was really about how to actually address these things, both through the storytelling and also visually, without falling into these traps of like, oh, is this going to be corny? Oh, they're going to get into the little salsa number or anything like that. But just kind of like writing from a perspective that honestly looked at our heritage. And the thing about being Latin is that, and I think this is not just a Puerto Rican thing, it's like we can march, we can protest, and at the same time we'll have our drums and guitars there and we'll start jamming. And that's just how we are as a people. And after the protest, somebody will put something on the stove and we'll start eating. And that's just how we do. And I needed to have that also represented in the comic book. So to me, there's even a soundtrack when I do the comics. So it's very kind of like 4-dimensional. It doesn't, well, maybe 5 with the smell as well.
That's why I do my
smells
comic.
like sancocho. Ay, qué rico. You know?
That's part of why I do my comic on uncoated paper, so that you can smell the ink on there. Yep. It's funny to see people, like especially people old, and they pick it up and I see them pull it forward to their, it's better to give
I
them
should
an
mix in
experience.
some sofrito into the ink next time it goes to the printing press. Be like, ay, qué rico, you know?
All right.
So hungry.
Anyone else internal, external senses of minority? You guys want to touch on that?
Are you sure? You want to start? Yeah.
Well, so for us, we have a white American character who's dealing with kind of gender sexuality issues in addition to this medical decision she has to make. And then a darker skinned Egyptian woman as the main characters. And the darker skin was also a purposeful selection on our part because there's a lot of colorism in Arab comics that we wanted to write against. So we realized that so many narratives of like, in order to, if you think of a movie that takes place in South Africa or in Rwanda or in Asia, whatever, you have to like identify with the white protagonist who goes there. And then you see the people as people through the white protagonist's relationship with them. And that's obviously problematic. And so what we did is our white American protagonist is the outsider. She's there in Egypt, and we can maybe more readily understand some of the things that she's going through, but the experiences are much more focused on the Egyptian characters, and you understand her kind of in relief. And what was the other thing I was going to say on the characters? I forgot. Oh, well, we encountered a lot of issues about, like, how do we get these American... They're queer. One of them's a queer woman of color. One's a white queer person. Who? How are we going to get them to depict Egypt if they haven't lived there? And so we all definitely went. Our artists, sorry. Yeah. So we did the field work in Egypt. We traveled. We met a lot of the people. But one of the things that I wasn't anticipating, because I'm not an artist, but maybe you guys are like, duh, is that so each one of our artists took on a main character. And the extent to which they were almost like method actors, they really got into the character because they're drawing the panel, they're using their own faces sometimes as models to do the expressions, and they were really living in some. Our artist who was working on the Egyptian character was like only listening to Egyptian music and only eating Egyptian food and just really living it, and that was fascinating for us because if we can get the artists there, then we can get the reader there. And that's the whole promise, right, of cross-cultural exchange in anthropology, is that we can understand each other even if we are not living in each other's bodies or skins.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, Edgardo was like, chiming in too, but it's like there is definitely like a performance art aspect to cartooning. Sometimes we call it the pantomime, like learning all the different facial expressions and different things like that. And I do some work in theater too. Like I actually do some like set design and like costume design and stuff like that, because I always think about like the stage is like one big panel and then like the action is going through like this big panel, Yeah, so there's definitely like relationships, I think, between like theater and performance art and comics. But I was thinking about the project you're talking about with Stacey Robinson. So a few years ago when the Avengers movie broke wide and made like $1 billion, right? I was
until this week.
I know, until this week. Yeah, exactly. Stacey Robinson, who is like, a really, really close friend of mine and my former grad student, we were talking about the relationship between Jack Kirby and Stan Lee. Because at the time, Stan Lee was getting a lot more praise. Jack Kirby wasn't really being attributed as a co-creator of these Marvel characters like Iron Man and X-Men and stuff like that. And he really didn't make a lot of money off of those particular, he did off of like some of his other creations with DC and, things like that. But me and Stacy were like, well, dude, they're not going to give his family any money. I mean, that's like $1 billion. You could break off some of that. So we think about the morality as a intentions with like legalities, right? And I was like, yeah, they're treating that brother like he black. And I was like, yeah, we should just call him Black Kirby. And I was like, that's a great idea. So we actually created this alternative history where, like, this character called Black Kirby was actually creating the same types of characters, using some of the the aesthetics of Jack Kirby, but through an Afrocentric lens. Because then we started to realize, like, through what's called critical making, right? You have critical thinking, but when you're actually making work as a designer, you're actually using a rhetorical skill set to do critical making. So we won't necessarily write like a book or like a theoretical paper or something like that. We'll actually create an object, a deliverable that is addressing a particular type of visual project. So we were like really inspired by this. We're like, well, what if he actually was referencing, his African diasporic heritage, or what if we actually made that fictitious connection between Malcolm X and Magneto, because it's not true, by the way, really more explicit. Or what if we actually like combine the notion of like T'Challa with like Huey P. Newton, and because the naming of the Black Panther Party actually is after the creation.
It's a
few months.
Yeah, it's like
months, three months or something like that. The utterance of Black Power is the same time. It's like 1966 in Mississippi, actually, right? So we started making these connections, and it's like before you knew it, we had created 120 artifacts, and it became a traveling show. That went around the world, right? But Black Kirby actually is me and Stacy. So we're also trying to subvert the museum practices of like, well, who did this? It's like Black Kirby did it. So we actually created like a third space where we could actually utilize the surrealistic, formal qualities of comics to our advantage. Because let me tell you, sometimes, man, being black in America is very surreal. It's damn surreal, you know what I'm saying? So we actually like played off of the idea of like the inherent surreality of that form to kind of circumvent those things. Because you can actually, like in hip hop, because like I taught. That is so hip hop. Yeah, very hip hop. No, dude. Yeah, so I used to teach a hip hop and hip hop and graphic design course at University of Illinois. That's why I founded it. Utilizing remix as a disruptive technology, because that's really what the heart of the culture is. Not necessarily, oh, it's graffiti. Graffiti is beautiful. But the formal aspects come from the DJ remixing, because you're literally taking like 2 sound bites and you're time traveling from one to the other. So when we were creating these remixed images through Black Kirby, right? So like Captain America became like Major Sankofa, Big Barda became Big Sister, Scott Free became Gil Scott Free, and Jill Scott Free, so those kind of things. And people were like, well, when are you guys going to put out the comic books? We were actually doing like mock covers as kind of like artifictions, not artifacts, but artifictions, to kind of pretend that this particular thing existed, right? And so that's why we started creating our own comics based off of Black Kirby as a creator, right? So we actually have this character called Kid Code, who is a hip-hop time traveler. It's like if you took African Bambaataa, Green Lantern, and Doctor Who and remixed them, So he actually time travels through a quilt, through like a cosmic quilt, and it's like these 4 intercosmic like DJs, right? And so the quilt as a technology, the African quilt that's remix. You're actually sampling from different pieces and then juxtaposing them almost like a comic book, right? So what he does is he jumps through into the proper time. It's called a needle drop, and it's called The Incredible. Like, once again, this is The Incredible. Yeah, so he's basically like looking for samples from God's voice, because God speaks the world into existence. And so he's actually like trying to actually go back to the original mix, because these evil DJs actually remix God's voice, because that's speaking things into existence, right? So yeah, that's Kid Code Channel 0. So we're utilizing hip hop, Afrofuturism, Afro-surrealism, design techniques to actually kind of circumvent and subvert the comics form.
Oh, very cool. Coleman, do you want to jump in? Okay, cool. I think we're coming up on question time. I feel like if I ask one more,
I want to just add one thing real quick. Jumping off on what the latter part of what he said, and I think this predates my work with La Borinqueña, having the opportunity to work with Darryl McDaniels, DMC, over the last like 5 years, making like 3 full-length graphic novels with him. It's really trippy, right? Because developing this universe, developing these characters with someone who is actually a veritable living icon of hip-hop culture and the hip-hop music industry, and seeing how it's literally this beautiful sample of one sampling over the other, and the other is sampling the other, and the one is sampling the other. And the whole idea of like hip hop monikers were inspired by comic books to begin with. Like when Darryl would get on the stage, he wanted to be the devastating mic controller because he was channeling the mighty Thor, the Incredible Hulk, all of these adjectives that preceded the hero's moniker, right? And the fact that we actually had the chance to make comic books. I mean, you could go back to a 1986 article in Rolling Stones when they were first profiling Run DMC at the height of their popularity, and the journalist is observing the backstage of one of these concerts, and Darryl's in the corner reading Spider-Man. And kind of like in his own zone, right? Because he's this introvert. On stage, he's like bombastic, and then off stage, he's mad chill. And to actually be able to make comics, so it's like beyond trippy. And what we were able to do is like we had the opportunity to remake comics, being that comics inspired these icons, and we brought in actual graffiti artists to actually throw in wild style graffiti, which had never been done until we actually started doing it. And bringing in someone from the wild style era like Mayor 139 to do a cover with Sal Buscema. Like two kind of like literal icons from two completely different genres and two completely different eras, and actually having the opportunity to mash them up. Or an icon like Bill Sienkiewicz, who did like EPMD covers and Jizza covers and from the 80s into the 2000s, and having him do a DMC cover, and having Bill Sienkiewicz say, "Oh, I've done mad hip-hop albums." And I'm like, I know. That's why you need to be on our project, you know?
I'm going to turn it over to some audience questions. You guys got questions? Anyone? All right, here, we'll start here.
Hi. So I'm going into the animation field, so I'm very interested in diverse media, and it inspires me as Afro-Latina. And so my question is, going into this field, what is the challenges that are brought forth to you as a minority in your voice, and how do you overcome these and get your ideas out there?
Well, first of all, if you're going into animation studios, you have to be very aware of the fine print when you actually do work for a design studio. I'm friends with a Dominican brother who actually lives on the West Coast who just quit working with, I believe it was Disney, after 5 years, because he realized that the fine print of his contract, he didn't realize it until after the fact, didn't actually allow him to create any of his own intellectual properties while in the physical time, not space, of working, meaning that he may do 9 to 5 at the Disney studios, and when he comes home, anything he created at home still owned by Disney. And he didn't realize this until he was actually at a Comic-Con, and he was actually like displaying his own creator-owned, his own individually developed properties. And within days of that coming out, of him being at San Diego Comic-Con, he's hit up by Disney's legal department saying, you're in breach of contract. All these characters you created, these are actually our characters. And so he quit. You know, and so that's number one. And number two, it's two different things. If you're going to work for a studio, you have to be very clear from the beginning. You are literally working with properties that are literally preceding your birth. And you really cannot put your own distinct style unless you're working on a major publisher where there is no specific style guide to how a Spider-Man or Wonder Woman looks beyond their costume look, right? But design, like animation studios, you are literally copycatting artists that are in the same physical space. So there really isn't any room at all for individuality. And in terms of the level of discrimination and that exists against people of color, and I have to like say that I fuck the word minority. So as people of color, it's challenging because there aren't that many people of color in the industry themselves. It's very, very few. I'm acquainted with a few like Chase Conley and others like that are constantly dealing with a lot of nonsense, prejudice, racism that's incorporated in the industry, and they know when to move on so that they can work on their own project. Chase is literally working from studio to studio from X amount of years, and when he quits that studio, then he starts working on his own individual intellectual property. Yep. So there's that challenge. So oftentimes younger artists who do work for studios, they work at a studio to pay their dues, to gain experience, and then they're like, okay, I'm good. I put in a good 3 to 5 years. Now it's time for me to do my own thing. Unless the pay is good and you just want to keep making somebody else's property. But there really isn't any room for individuality when you work for a major studio or publisher.
John, Coleman, anyone?
Yeah, some similar issues. I was, I don't know, let's keep it short, because I was like, you know, in my particular space, you know, I really do embrace who I am. Like, I'm black on purpose, like every day, for real. You know, because I know that the stereotypes that I'm pushing against that have been like working against us for generations, I'm definitely, you know, pushing against those things. So I would say embrace who you are. Definitely try to find as many mentors and allies as possible, and blow it out of the water. Be amazing. Be unstoppable. I know that seems like really like, oh, pie in the sky, but yeah, you really have to be dope. Like Shauna Mills, for instance. She's dope. She's dope. You know what I'm saying? She's really, really talented, and she's a black woman working in animation, and she is fire.
And she left Harlem to move to L.A.
That's right.
and slept on somebody's couch for a few months without a job.
Yep.
Literally was like, I'm going to find me a job.
Yep.
And like she hustled and hustled and hustled and has actually done that. And works with studios and now has taken time off from studios so that she can actually work on her own intellectual property.
That's right.
And not to jump on you, but the other thing that is important, especially as a young person, is that I'm 47, right? And we're all up here. We're like, okay, I'm in my 40s. I don't know. I'm not going to speak for anybody else. Okay, cool. It isn't going to happen right now or next summer or in 2 summers or 10 summers from now. It just started happening for me. And for us, for the most part. And I think there's that myth that young people fall in. It's like, right now. And I was like, no, build is happening right now. And now the opportunity comes right now. Hell yeah, jump on it. But for the most part, be patient because life isn't over at 22.
That's right. You got to be this idea of like being in the woodshed. Going to the woodshed and practicing. I always tell my students, like, how do you become a great boxer? You take a lot of hits and you throw a lot of punches, right? So those are the things you have to be awesome, and undeniable. Okay.
Yeah, I also do a comic book, and it's about like a Latino theme. But I find that people want to do stuff with people who do stuff. So I would say do stuff, and if you want to, and I know that sounds ridiculous, but that's literally, it's hard for people to extrapolate based on ideas. Like, oh, there's this thing I kind of want to do. Like, just show them what we want to do, and if it wants to be like culturally significant to you, then do it on your own and own it. And if you get out in the world and you put your foot forward as doing something that's personal and culturally significant to you, then they'll hire you based on that, as opposed to like, look how well I can draw Mickey Mouse. They're going to hire you to draw Mickey Mouse, and then you're like, oh, I thought we could do this other ethnic thing, and they're not going to think of you that way. So always, put out there what you want to do and not what you can do, because if you'll end up doing something you don't like that way. So yeah, so just make stuff. You don't need permission to be creative. Just make stuff now. Yeah. We had another question, right? Did you? Here. All right. Here, we'll start here and we'll work our way forward. So.
Hi. I'm sorry. I may have come in late, but I was wondering if Love and Rockets was of any influence to you guys, or if you've heard of that comic. Oh yeah. Okay.
It was an influence, but not from a storytelling or even a visual storytelling. What was an influence for me is the entrepreneurism of those dudes, right? Because they had the chance to do their own property and saw at a very early stage how much more important it was to retain the rights to their own property and do it for themselves and continue to do it themselves and establish their own brand. And that's kind of like what I looked up to, because instead of shopping my property to either a major publisher or even a small press, I decided to do it 100% independently like those cats did.
I know for me, I liked the fact that they were just Latino and they weren't like, this is a Latino comic. Like, it's stories about humanity, and it just so happens to be Latino people. We've also, I know John and I have had the benefit of working with Jaime and Gilbert and like all of the brothers Hernandez. They've become like friends, and yeah, they're it's cool to see the work ethic, like having enjoyed it as a project, but then meeting those guys, and they're just like John was saying, they're just like, yeah, I just sit down and draw. It's one damn panel after another.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I was so for me, it's like I was reading Love and Rockets coming up, in high school in Mississippi. I was like, I was reading, like, isn't that crazy? I was reading like Love and Rockets and all these different independent things. I was looking for other things. I love comics, not just superhero comics, but I love the medium, right? So then, like, you fast forward to like say 2005 when they do the Masters of American Comics show, which, don't get me wrong, there was some amazing artists, 15 of the greatest comic book artists to ever touch a quill pen, like Jack Kirby, Will Eisner, right? No women in that show, no women. And I'm sorry, but if you're not mentioning Los Brothers Hernandez in any show dealing with like comics in America, then you're not being inclusive. And so actually that's part of what started me and Damien looking at inclusion across the board. That show is actually what led us to do the Out of Sequence show, which kind of jumped off our careers. So not seeing Colleen Duran, Wendy Peeney, Hilda Terry any of these like groundbreaking women and people who just happen to be minorities. The only person that was in it that was George Harriman, who was actually passing as white. They found out later, actually. He's from down south. He was actually, yeah, I know. He was like, oh, wait a minute, we let one in, like, you know what I'm saying? But yeah, but seriously, it was a very, very like controlled space, right? It was like, okay, well, comics is everything. Comics can be anything. So that's actually, them not being in that show actually was the shape of an absence, so to speak. I use that term a lot. Shape of an absence is what actually started me thinking about this idea.
Do you get Coleman, Sherine, do you guys have any Hernandez brothers at all? No, sorry.
So I ultimately want to ask, what is the best way to include diversity but not be subjected to tokenism? Because I've noticed that there's a lot of shows where they absolutely fall into this kind of trap. So what is the best way to do the research and incorporate different diversities without just having it either simplify or just resort to these characters? And just especially when it's a culture that you're not as well familiar with.
So I have a background in theater and performance, and this is like a really basic just casting thing, which is, so like one of the critiques that you make about like casting is, well, 80% of the roles are written for white people right now, like in film, television, and 20% are written for non-white people, like, which is massive, right? Like, and part of the issue is that some of those roles that are written for white people, like, don't have to be white people. Like, they're just like a lot, like very few roles are actually written like for and about like white people if you actually just think about the role and who could occupy that role. But that still doesn't get to the problem of like production, right? Like, and the problem of like who is writing these roles, right? Which is what like this, like, so who's writing this work? That should absolutely, like whose voices are being held, who's writing the voices? And that's a really important, I think, question to be asking yourself in terms of, you know, one of the things that we worked on is like in a collaborative production is, well, how do we do honest authorship that's collaborative, that's not writing about a perspective, but that's writing with, if you are not writing from your own position. There you go. And so I think that's an important thing. But then the other thing is, I mean, you know, not like, one of the things that we've been talking about, or our own project too, is like, and what you were saying is like, well, a lot of roles are just like about different dimensions of the human condition, which is not to say that they're like that's one among many possibilities of how to write or what to write about. But to that extent, there's no need to fall into a kind of tokenism. And in fact, like it's lazy. Yeah, it's like it's just bad writing.
Bad writing.
Yeah.
Exactly. You don't be a bad writer.
I want to give an example of a not good writing idea, but it's also a shout out to my editor for the Muslim American graphic novel I'm working on, Namrata Tripathi, who just started her own imprint at Penguin Random House for young adults called Kokila, and it's about voices from the margins and hybrid identities. And we were talking, for example, about books that my kids read in school where it's a white protagonist and the subjugation of a minority person, like the black kid at school who is subject to all of this racism is just a lesson for the white protagonist to learn from. And you're subjugating people to, you know, re-experiencing trauma through that story. You're not teaching black readers anything that they don't already know. I mean, another example was, you know, someone who tried to be inclusive, and so she said, oh, I'm gonna write this like scenario where, you know, the current US government decides to make, what do you call it, like internment camps for Muslims, like today. And it's like, okay, well, what did that achieve? Like, all you did to achieve was say not all Muslims are terrorists, which every Muslim kid already knows. So if the point of diversity, should be inclusion for readers, not just, you know, adding color for the moral edification of the white protagonist. That's not true inclusion.
And don't write for white people. Like, that's the problem with those.
Yeah,
two,
those
right?
stories
the
are getting
moral
written,
is like,
for sure,
don't
yeah.
write stories for white people. Like, yeah, like
For only white people.
yeah.
Right.
No, for white people.
Yeah.
Teach white people a lesson. It's like, well,
That's hilarious. Yeah, that's from Toni Morrison says.
You guys have any thoughts on that? Or
No, I was just
pretty
saying,
well- yeah, do we get another question? Anyone? All right, we're good. I'm going to ask one last question, and then we'll, because I think we're running low on time, we'll end on this last question. So I think, like, with the success of things like The Big Sick and Master of None, Black Panther, Coco, I think there might be a thought maybe in the Anglo community to like declare racism over, kind of like, here, have your victory lap. You guys did it. You're number one, in all these areas, which we all kind of know untrue. So with the prominence of these projects in American culture, what do you think next steps? What can they be? Where would you like to take them?
I mean, I'm just gonna keep writing. I don't write in with this kind of like idea board in front of me saying, we're gonna run a studio and take over Hollywood. I'm making comics, and if writing these comics can take me from my studio in Brooklyn to University of Arizona so that I can engage in these conversations, then that right there in and of itself is revolutionary. Because it isn't just a comic book that's ending up on somebody's long box inside of a plastic bag, but it really should be about introducing a story or a tangible, readable book. And that's why I don't go digital, because I literally want people to hold this book in their hand. Is where the true power lands. And you know what? It's Coco and Black Panther, Wrinkle in Time, and all these other films and series are dope, but they're literally a gotita. Literally just a little drop.
Yep.
And that doesn't change anything. You know what I'm saying? That's like when we had President Obama. He was one black president who was actually multiracial, one out of like 45 presidents that we had. That doesn't change shit. So it's really about, continuing to do the work. Right. It's about that relentless persistence. It's about being deliberate and intentional when we're doing our storytelling. Unfortunately, we can't afford to just kind of like, at least I don't see myself as a storyteller that can just kind of chill and just write stories for the sake of stories. I write stories and I try to inject a lot as much as possible, because I know that there's this massive vacuum that exists, that even when Latin characters are introduced into mainstream publishing, they're just Latin by name.
There you go.
There's nothing else incorporated culturally into them, and that's that stupid shit that's always missing. It's like, it's such a part of our nuances. So many little things that make us who we are. Like I referenced before about the food and the music and stuff like that. That's these little things that make us distinctively who we are. And how they were alluding to in their book, in terms of like talking about spirituality, it's incorporated into actual daily life.
I'm gonna cut you off. We're running real low on time. I don't want to get these guys' thoughts on it. Sorry.
I just kind of to piggyback a little bit. Yeah, it's Black Panther for me is like it's a crack in the door. You know what I'm saying?
Sure. Well, that's what I'm saying. Like, now that
it's not busting down the door. It's like, hey, I can see a little bit of things. Wait, people of color like speculative fiction? Who the thug it? Right?
You really are just like us.
Who the thug it? Yeah, you're just like us. Exactly. I mean, because we're talking about like, there's still like rampant, racism. I mean, the systems that are in America are like they're designed to like unmake people who don't have access to power. That's what they're designed to do. So, Black Panther is amazing, though. I mean, you can see, like, kids saying, that's me on the poster, or, like, the Black Panther challenges, all these different things. That's great. That's great. But it does occlude the work on the everyday of, like, people who are independent, who are feeding themselves on a day-to-day basis with their creations as well. Because, the mouse takes up all the air. You know what I'm saying? Takes up all, the Disney, the mouse, takes up all the air. It's hard to talk about these other spaces. So there's something really powerful about having control of your own IP, your own consciousness, your own agency, and pushing that forward. And that's what I'm about. I'm going to go see Black Panther in 3D probably pretty soon, and A Wrinkle in Time. But we need to know that these particular projects are just, like you said, a drop in the bucket. For real, Hooray.
Okay, I just want to say two things about the drops in the bucket, or just the cracks through the door. One is that prove that we are far from over. One is that they're often accompanied by a lot of backlash. So, you talk about Obama, my God, but like Black Panther, like why did they get okay. And then second,
Wakanda's not real. Wakanda's not real.
Right. The second, the fact that we are celebrating Black Panther as the Black Empowerment movie, that's a consequence of racism, right? Because we have so few, and so we have to celebrate, and we're so excited about it. But when we get to that point where it's just a movie, right? Where we're loving all movies, and we don't even have to think about it in those. We are far from there, but that would be a nice place to go to.
One more thing I wanted to add too was like Jordan Peele just won Best Screenplay, right? For Get Out, right?
Yeah.
first African American ever win that award, right? I want to get to the point where there's no more the firsts. You know,
Oh,
there's
for
no
sure.
more
Yeah,
the
yeah.
firsts. You know what I'm saying? That's what I want, you know. Okay.
That's a perfect place to end. All right, thank you guys all.
That's
for
it.
Yeah. Have a good day.
Thank y'all.
Again, support the festival if you can. Keep this whole going and free.